Well, good evening, everyone. Tonight is week 4 of the Beginner's Guide to VHF UHF. I'm Anthony Luscre, K8CT.
And I'm Marty Woll, N6 Victor India.
This is my contact information and my website. And this is Marty's
And that's my
contact
info.
information. And tonight's slides are available at tiny.cc/bgvhf. Dan will also be posting them with the materials at the RATPAC site. Anytime you see this little symbol or see this font, that means there's a link you can click on in the slideshow to get more resources. If you need a PDF of the document, you can click here. And this is the 4th week of a 4-week series. We did the rest of it last summer. We will post the link to the slideshow within this slide right now after it's done. But right now, if you want to view any of the previous recordings, you can just click on these links. This is our week 4 schedule, and we'll be skipping between myself and Marty for different ones here. So let's go ahead and jump into our material. Setting up and using a VHF UHF radio. First of all, you will need your manual for your radio. If you have it, go get it now before you get started. If you lost it or did not get one when you bought your used radio, check the manufacturer's website for an electronic copy. Check vendors' websites for an electronic copy. An electronic version can often be faster, as you can use Control F to quickly search for terms in the manual. You can also find YouTube showing programming of your model, your specific radio model. We'll be talking about generalities for the most part tonight. Note, different manufacturers often use different terms for the same function. For example, some companies refer to the button, the knob as the RIT button, and other ones refer to it as the clarifier. So we'll try and keep this generic, but just realize that sometimes the terms we use may not be exactly the same from manufacturer to manufacturer. So you've got a new VHF UHF radio and you want to try it out and work someone. You're not sure what settings you need to make. You want certain channels and memories, but the manual is somewhat intimidating. We're going to talk tonight about the 5 main steps for setting up your radio for an FM repeater. These will also apply to setting up for simplex, which we'll be talking a little bit about later. First of all, you need to find the local repeater frequencies information. You need to tune the radio to the repeater frequency and choose the offset, also sometimes referred to as the shift. You need to test the repeater by transmitting, and anytime you transmit, reminding you that you must ID at that same time. Don't just kerplunk and go away. If necessary, set the CTCSS and try again. And after everything is working, save the settings in a memory. We're going to go through these in more detail as we go along. But where do you find that information for the repeaters? We have 4 links here, and as I said earlier, whenever you see this font or these little symbols, that means you can click on it and that'll take you out to a web resource, a video, a website. In this case, it is amateur radio repeaters, and you can do a quick search by state, by frequency, etc. I'm in Ohio, so I could click on Ohio, close the little advertisement, and you'll see that they have not only 2-meter repeaters, but they also have 6-meter, 10-meter, 220, 70 centimeter, 33 centimeter, and 23 centimeter. And I forgot the 10-meter ones also. So there's a wide variety here. You can also search by city. So we have 4 different resources here. These are all free to use. Some of them might have premium features, but you can use the basic information without any cost. There's also the ARRL repeater directory, which might be handy to have in your glove box. You can get the electronic format. There is a cost for that. And when you look up the information, in addition to the frequency, you're going to want to note the other settings. So when we look at any of these repeaters on this list, you're going to see that there's other information included in that particular page. So let me just jump out here to a repeater that I recognize the location of. We'll just go to, here we go. So this particular repeater is on 147.27. This just happens to be my local club. Has a +6 megahertz offset. Has a tone of 110.9. So that's the kind of information you're going to need to know. Also, it's good to know that it's on the air when you're finding out the basic information. one of the things I mentioned before was tone. The full name of this is CTCSS, Continuous Tone Coded Squelch System. This is a generic term. There are some copyrighted terms. You might have heard of PL, which is a private, I forget what the L stands for.
Private line, that was a
Thank you,
Motorola.
private line. Thank you, Marty. What these do is they make it possible to minimize co-channel interference. We have another repeater that has the same exact frequency in Toledo. Under most propagation conditions, it's not a problem, but occasionally that repeater can be heard here, and it would cause problems when I would transmit if I would bring up the Toledo repeater instead of my local repeater. So by using these codes, it can help to let the repeater know that I am trying to get to it as opposed to the Toledo one. The offsets vary by band and frequency, so different bands, we use different offsets. So on the 2 meter band, remember it was 0.6 megahertz or 600 kilohertz, and depending on what part of the band you're in, it's either plus or minus. Now, occasionally some repeaters might use a non-standard offset, so you'll need to note that and make sure you put that information in correctly. For more information on using repeaters in general and the PL tone encode method, I have a link here. Another link here on how to use amateur radio repeaters by N4UJW, and one by K0NR called Get the Right Signal Tone. And in that article, he talks about all the different types of tones that are used in addition to CTCS. So he sort of talks about all the different types of tones. So when someone uses the term tone, there can be some confusion, but he goes through all the different types in this particular presentation. Repeaters vary again in where they're placed in the band, what the offset is. So this is just a list showing where the repeaters are in each of the bands and what the offset is for those repeaters in that particular part of the band. This is from the website Ham Radio for Dummies. There is a companion website that goes along with the Ham Radio for Dummies books, and it's actually very good. Now, as far as setting up memories, we have a couple different options. First option is manually enter in the info and save it to memory. The second one is to use a computer interface to connect and software to program the memories that way. And the third one is to clone an already programmed radio to an identical model radio that is not programmed. This does not typically require a computer to do it. It just requires a special cable, and it has to have the ability built into the radio to do the cloning. So there are some pluses and minuses to each of these, and I'm going to turn it over to Marty now to continue.
You're muted.
You're muted, Marty.
There we go. Thank you. The temptation to take what is probably the easiest way is pretty strong, especially when you're new. To manually enter, it certainly takes time. You're going to have to learn the keyboard and the labels. And given the small size of handhelds these days, and the number of functions that they have available, most keys, most buttons on the radio have multiple functions. One may be you have to push function first, and then F, and then the knob, whatever it is. So it can seem daunting at first, but I don't want that to get in the way, because there's some really strong reasons to be able to do this manually. For one thing, you don't need special cables or software, just the radio itself and the manual or a cheat sheet, which we will discuss later. The biggest reason, I think, is if you're in the field and you need to make a change and you don't happen to have your programming software and your computer and everything else handy, you should be able to do this on the fly. And by the way, we're not talking just about handhelds, but mobile radios, same exact thing applies. I remember being on a deployment for statewide medical exercise, and one of my radios just basically took a dump, and it froze up completely. So I had to I had my manual with me. I did a complete reset, and that meant all the memories were empty. And so I had a handheld as a backup, and I used the handheld for when they called me. until I was able to sit there and quickly reprogram the key repeaters back into the radio, because I'd done it enough times that it wasn't a big problem. I knew the sequence, and I didn't even really have to refer to the manual once I remembered how to actually empty it out and start from scratch. So in an emergency, it can be really important. Somebody may say, hey, we need you set up to do this repeater, and it's not one that you had programmed in. You can do it. Yeah, you may make some mistakes, but you'll find that out soon enough. If you don't get the response or people can't hear you. And I always say, if you've got a mobile radio, keep a handheld handy as a backup, and also you'll be able to hear whether you're transmitting on the right frequency or not, and so on. But with care, you can do it. Next. Software is available. Sometimes it's free software from the manufacturer. Sometimes it's third-party software. Some of it's free, some of it's pay. I've seen some very good software. There's a fellow in the UK who unfortunately is retired now, but he put out some great software for Yaesu radios. One of the advantages is you can do multiple memories quickly simply by filling in more or less a spreadsheet, which turns into a file that dumps into the radio. So you can see what you're doing before you actually program it. And that, of course, reduces the chance of error. And if you have more than one radio of a particular model, you can put the same program in all of them if you want. You can populate your input spreadsheet from possibly other sources. The downsides, the downsides, it requires usually software and some cable. There's some money spent for the cable, but generally speaking, it's not a huge amount compared to the radio. And by the way, if you are going to get an interface cable, make sure if it has a chip in it, it's an FTDI chip, not a prolific chip. Nothing wrong with prolific as they originally built them, but that is the most copied and bootlegged kind of chip out there. So if you get one, a cable, you don't know whether it's a knockoff or whether it's the real thing. FTDI, it's not as much of a problem, and they tend to be reliable. So keep that in mind. And of course, generally you'll need a computer. And if you rely on this solely, if you have to programming something in the field, you won't be able to do it. Cloning is actually pretty fast. Not every radio has the ability to do this, and it usually takes a special cable. But if you've got one radio set up with everything you want and you happen to have a duplicate, you could basically make the second one exactly the same as the first. And if you make a change to one of the radios, you have to maybe change a PL for a repeater because they had to change tones, or you have to add a repeater, or you have to add some other frequency. You can quickly clone it again, and away you go. Now, that's only if you have the same model of radio. I happen to be a fan of, trying to keep several of the same model available. For one thing, I'm used to using that particular set of commands. And so if something goes down, I can grab the same radio, and if it's programmed up, then, it's just carry on as normal. Next. So, when you get your new radio, sometimes if you get it from a local dealer, they will offer, hey, we have this code plug that we give to everybody in this town, and we're happy to plug it in there for you. And so they basically pre-program your radio with the most popular repeaters and other frequencies. Or maybe a member of your club can say, hey, I'll go ahead and program it up for you. And that's okay. I mean, it gets you there fast and it gets you on the air. But at some point, you're going to have to you'll be able to change something yourself. And you don't want to have to run back to another ham or to the dealer, which is probably going to be tough by then, and say, hey, can you add this? Can you take that out? Can you change that? So let's talk about how you set up manually. You should all try this. And in fact, you may find that it's not nearly as daunting as you thought it might be. And you get pretty good at it after you do it for several several different entries, pretty soon it becomes almost automatic. So first thing, of course, you get a new radio, make sure you label it with your call sign, make a record of the serial number, and keep that separate. Most radios have something called an automatic repeater shift function. You remember the table that Anthony showed you with typical, where the repeaters are and the offsets. Often that automatic repeater shift, where if you tune to 147,900, it'll automatically shift you down to 147,300 for transmit. Well, I would suggest you turn that off. It's often on by default. And the reason you want to turn it off is that first, there may be repeaters that are an exception to the general which way up, which way down rule. And second, and probably more important, you may be, particularly for emergency communication folks, one of the standard procedures is if the repeater is down, go simplex on the output. Well, if your repeater insists on making you transmit up or down 600, you can't go simplex on the output. You're going to have to go and disable the thing. So disable it at the start. Anytime you program a repeater in, you can tell it what shift you want, and that way it won't bite you when you really need to go simplex on the output of a repeater. If there's some polling feature of some sort, like Yaesu has their wires program, and probably other radios have something similar, I would say disable it. It's something you're rarely going to need. If your group needs it, then you can go ahead and re-enable it. But if you don't disable it, then every time you accidentally hit, say, the 0 key when you're holding it, then every time you transmit, everybody's going to hear a beep and block out the first couple of seconds of your transmission, and they're going to everybody say, hey, turn your wires off. Okay, it's embarrassing, and it will prevent people from hearing what it is you're saying and tie up the whole system. So just disable that. There are plenty of instructions out there on how to get that thing disabled. So make sure you follow that. Now, this is personal preference, but when you first get a radio, every time you touch a button, say to program it, you're going to get a beep. That's really annoying. I prefer to do that in silence. I could do it without bothering people around me if I have to program something. And certainly if it has, this is probably more common on the CB and FRS radios, what we call the Roger beep, which means when you let go of the push to talk, it sends a little beep to tell the other person you're done transmitting. That's really not used in amateur radio. So if it has one, turn it off. All this stuff can be turned off with the menus in you locate the manual. You'll find a way to make these adjustments. So make sure you get the manual and read it. Read it through once, because you're going to find that the parts you need are not in the same order that you're going to use them. Typically, the stuff about repeaters is one place, the stuff about tones is another, the stuff about saving, how to save something in a memory is in a different chapter. So you're going to go through your manual and extract and make your own handwritten notes for each of these steps. And then once you've got them, then you can put it into a nice, neat format. And I'll show you an example of that later. So the first thing you want to do is make sure you're in the VFO mode. VFO is variable frequency oscillator, which basically means you can adjust the frequency by punching a button or turning a dial. Memory mode, obviously, you're limited to whatever has already been programmed. Now, if it's a new radio, there's nothing in memory yet. But if the radio has been used before, there may be things in memory that you do or don't need. Make sure you get into the VFO mode. And then the first thing you're going to do is set the desired receive frequency. Now, the receive frequency, some radios you can do with a keypad. You'll have to experiment. Some say, well, you don't have to hit the first one because everything's one, or, see how it goes and make sure you know how to enter it. If you use the dial, almost all of them, you can use the dial to turn up or down the frequency. And sometimes there's a function that allows you to go up by megahertz. So if you turn on the radio, it's at 144. Well, you can go, function whatever and tune, 145, 6, 7. Now you're there and you don't have to keep turning the dial and turning the dial. Then turn that that speed function off and go back and dial where you want to go. Next thing you're going to want to do is set the transmitter power level. Now, that's not always high. If you're in an area where you have good coverage, lots of signal margin to a local repeater that you can see out your window, you don't need to be putting out the maximum power from your handheld. It just eats up battery and it heats up the radio, especially for long transmissions. So try setting it down at a lower, usually most of these handhelds have 2 or 3 settings. The mobile radios often have 4 power settings. Go lower and see if it works. If it works fairly reliably, leave it there. You can always boost it up later with a couple of button pushes. But if you're going to go simplex, excuse me, you're probably going to go on the higher end of the power. And then if it's a repeater, you're going to want to set that offset that Anthony mentioned earlier, typically plus or minus 600 kilohertz on 2 meters, plus or minus 5 megahertz on 440, and then each of the other bands has a standard offset, which most of the repeaters in your area will probably follow. Okay, next. Now, set the tone. Now, tone encode is what Anthony was mentioning earlier, and that is basically to tell a particular repeater that you are trying to access it and not some other repeater that may be co-channeled. If you don't have the tone set to send a tone, the repeater, it may hear your signal, but it won't pass it through. So make sure you got that one right. Now, often there is a second, sometimes you step through these functions, encode, decode. Be careful about the decode. That's actually CTCSS refers to the decode. And that means your radio won't hear a signal on that given frequency unless that signal is transmitting the tone. Well, in a few cases where repeaters are close enough together and you want to make sure it doesn't trigger on somebody else's repeater, you can do that. However, remember, having a tone squelch means you can't hear what's going on the frequency unless that tone is being sent by somebody else. So if there's somebody strong near you that doesn't have the tone, they may blank out your receiver. Your radio hears it, but you don't, and you may not know that somebody is calling you because the radio is basically blocked from putting audio through because there's a strong signal, stronger than the one you're trying to hear, and it doesn't have that tone. So I would not set the receive side of the tone unless your group specifically instructs you to do it. So now you've got it to where it works. Of course, at this point, you punch it up, hook it to an antenna, make sure that you are in fact activating the repeater if that's what you're setting. And then now you want to store it. Okay, now usually there are a couple of options here. You're going to select a memory channel, and that's a whole separate subject, but you want to try and group these things logically. If you're with a group that has a comm plan, with Aries 1 through 10, you might want to use channels 1 through 10 or 21 through 30 or whatever, and have them in a logical order where you'd likely use them. And then once you've selected that memory, make sure there isn't something already in it. Now, usually gives you a couple of choices. You can just store it and leave it there. And when you recall that memory, it'll show the receive frequency and the other settings. Or you could give it a name. It's very handy to give it a name. Now, most radios only allow for maybe 6 characters or so, maybe 8. So think carefully about how you want to label these things. But that can save a lot of time just by looking at, it may say Mount D, Mount D Aries or whatever. That's pretty handy. Or it may say Aries 6. But when you're ready to store, there are usually 2 different paths. One is store it without an alphanumeric, and the other is store it with. So make sure you note the instructions for how you save it and still leave open the opportunity to give it an alphanumeric tag. Next. Okay, we talked about power levels. Your battery, you don't always need the high power. Your battery runtime will be much longer on low power because receive uses very little power on most radios, and transmit is what eats it up. If you're transmitting on lower power and you're making it fine, you'll have a lot more time. And also, especially with the modern radios being fairly compact and the handhelds usually having no active cooling mechanism, especially if you're having long transmissions, you got it on high power, you're going to heat that radio up, and the internal components are going to get hotter, and heat is kind of the enemy of electronics. So that's why we say, can try it a little lower power, and if it works, then you can leave it that way. And if you need to bump it up, you can. Now, cheat sheets. As we said, the steps are all in the manual, but not where you necessarily want them. So remember I said, start writing down these steps in your own words so that you can understand it. Now you're going to take that and turn it into an actual document. I use Word, and then I can save it. And often I'll take an image from the manual of the front panel and pop it in there so that I can see just what button is where. And now I have everything in one place in the exact order I need it. Okay.
And Marty, that's a very good tip. Also, if you're someone out, you're going to be handing the radio to someone else, to have that cheat sheet in their hand that you can give them.
Yeah. I have actually had situations where somebody in our Aries group got a new, in fact, two new hams got a new radio of a model that I don't have, and they had no idea how to get them going. So I went and found the manual online, and I developed a programming sheet for them that I then emailed them, and I said, try this. I don't have the radio, so I can't prove to myself that it works, but this should be all the steps you need in the order you need them for a radio I'd never seen or touched. And they both called back and said it worked perfectly. So, that's kind of the power of extracting information from a manual and then using it. So this is just the first half of a sample cheat sheet. If we have time later, I'll pull up some of the ones that I've done for other radios so you can see what it looks like in full. But so here's what you're going to start in the VFO mode. All these things that we just talked about: set the receive frequency, set the power, set the shift, set the tone, and then we have go on to the saving functions. Somebody in chat mentioned a nifty manual. Yes, some of those have the Nifty is a separate company, and they publish quickie manuals for lots of radios, and they are definitely simpler than the factory manual. But as I say, I like to make my own because I want, having read the steps and having looked at the steps and done them, I can understand it, and I can put it in as compact a form as necessary and still understand what it is I'm supposed to do. Here's an example of one of the cheat sheets that somebody made for a Baofeng, which I understand is a little more complex than some of the other radios.
And this is a list of a number of cheat sheets that I found out there for the FT65. This first one has multiple radios on there for cheat sheets. So these are all free resources that you can use.
Okay, Anthony, I think it's back to you.
Yeah, the first one I just want to show you. This, as you can see, there's quite a few radios in this list. So let's talk a little bit about now using programming software. Really, there's about 5 different options for the programming software. Sometimes the software comes with the radio from the manufacturer, or you can download it for free on their website, and that's the best case scenario. There's no extra cost involved for the software. Sometimes the manufacturer offers the software as an extra dollar option, so you can buy the software from the manufacturer. You can also go to third-party commercial vendors, such as RT Systems, which is one of the most popular ones out there. And RT Systems sells their software for programming as either standalone or you can buy it bundled with the interface cables. There's also a free third-party software called Chirp. There are other programs out there, but the RT Systems is probably the most common commercial, and Chirp is probably the most common free software out there for general radios. Now, as far as programming software, don't confuse this with the software that's used for doing firmware upgrades. Many radios nowadays have firmware upgrades capability, and that's a completely different thing than the software for programming in memories. Also, don't confuse it with CAT, computer-aided transceiver. This is software that's used to control the frequency or other functions of the radio while you're using it with logging or contesting software. Also, don't confuse it with remote control software. This is used to operate the radio over the internet, Bluetooth, or other means. So those are all softwares that are out there, but they're not programming software. Also, don't confuse it with the software for digital FM voice programming. DMR radios, D-Star, and Fusion have different types of software involved because there's quite a bit of programming that takes place in those. What we're really referring to is analog FM memory programming software. Now you're going to need an interface cable, and as was already stated, please avoid cheap cables with counterfeit drivers in them. I always look for the FTDI chips and not the prolific chips. You may save a few bucks, but you may get a lot of headaches. So I would definitely follow Marty's advice. I follow the same advice myself. The Chirp software is free open source tool for programming your amateur radio. There's versions for Windows, Mac, and Linux. Supports a large number of radios, as well as provides a way to interface with multiple data sources and formats. And there's a link here that will take you out to the website where you can download the software, and even probably more important is find out what radios are supported. Not all radios are supported, and quite often they're adding new radios all the time, but just make sure your radio is supported. There are some notes on some of the radios that it may not be fully supported, but only partially supported. But you can see there's quite a few radios out there in the list. Now, we don't have time to go through using Chirp fully here, so I have a beginner's guide, how to use Chirp to program a typical radio such as the Bofang UV5R. How do you find your COM port for the Chirp software? Ham radio programming with Chirp, latest walkthrough tutorial, and an awesome trick for Chirp programming that lets you edit some things in a very slick way. So these are all resources if you want to get more information on Chirp. Now, the third method of programming was to use the cloning method. And first of all, you need to find out whether your particular radio supports it. Not every radio supports cloning. Many do, but not all of them do. The first thing you need to do is set up the radio's memories, whether you do it manually or whether you do it with programming software. There's no reason to clone until you get the first radio's memories all set up, and I would test everything before you clone it. You then either need to buy or build the cloning cable. Now, the cloning cable is not the same as the programming cable. This is usually a cable that has connections to go into both of the radios as opposed to a radio and a computer. Typically, cloning does not require software, but you have to go through a sequence of controls on the radio. So you need to know the manufacturer's procedure for cloning. Most of them require you to hold down one key while you press the power on. That puts it into the cloning mode, and then you might need to push the up button to start the cloning, or the down button to receive the cloning. But you need to find out exactly how your model works as far as cloning. Here's an example of the instructions for cloning a Yaesu FT65, which is a newer radio that's very popular. And you'll notice that it uses the SCU36 cable. But the SCU36 cable is simply two 3.5 millimeter jacks connected to each other, but you have to make sure it's wired properly. So you might want to buy the cable itself, or you may want to dig in deeper and find out about building your own. But you see the whole steps involved here. You have to do a specific key sequence to go through cloning. Cloning the Baofeng, again, here's the instructions. And again, you have to go through very specific things on which keys you hold down when you turn the power on. You want to hold this key down, not those two keys, etc., etc. And you'll be able to clone a Baofeng radio. Here's a cloning the Yaesu FT290OR, which is a mobile radio, and you can build this cloning cable very easily. It's two RJ12 plugs, only using 2 of the pins on each one. This is the continued instructions for that. So those are the methods for cloning. Again, make sure you follow all the instructions so you don't end up with a dead radio when you're done. So now I'm going to turn back to you, Marty.
All right, we're back, and let me just give you one quick warning when you're cloning a radio. One of the radios is going to be the master, if you will, and the other will be the slave or the receive radio. Make sure you are doing it in the right direction. And don't ask me how I know, but
We've all done that.
If you push the transmit button on the wrong radio, you will take the contents of an empty radio and copy them onto one that you spent all that time programming. Yes, it can happen. So be careful. Remember, you're never going to push a transmit button on the radio that's being, that is waiting to be programmed. So just a word of caution from somebody who's been there. All right, so now you got everything programmed and you try and hit your local repeater, and for some reason you can't hit it. Well, gosh, it looked like everything was okay, but clearly there's an issue. So let's look at some of the causes. Okay, generally, first, the radio may not be functioning properly for one reason or another. There are all sorts of little, maybe it has a lock on it so it can't transmit, who knows? But more than likely, one of the problems is that the repeater may not be in your range. If you go back to our earlier presentations, we'll talk about, how to improve the range by selecting the antennas and so on. But just because the repeater shows as being in your area doesn't necessarily mean that your radio can hit it. You may have set the power too low. And for this particular repeater, maybe there's an obstacle nearby. You need to ramp the power up. You can try it on higher power. The repeater may be out of service. If you know somebody else who's using the same repeater, you can check with them and find out. But usually, by listening, you'll hear whether people are using the repeater or not. If you can't hear the repeater, that's a sign in itself. If you know somebody else who's in the same group and is using the same repeater, you can ask them to come up and key up the repeater, and you can kind of check and they can listen for you and so on. You may have outdated information for the repeater, especially in RF dense areas like here, Southern California. People have to change, repeater owners have to change PLs once in a while because they have another co-channeled radio and somewhere nearby, and they're trying to the coordinators are trying to make sure that both can function without too much interference to the other, and that may mean that somebody has to change a tone. So make sure you have the latest information. If the repeater owner has a website, that's great. That's usually current. But if you have a 3-year-old repeater directory, might need to update that. And of course, then there's always the possibility that you have programmed in one or more of the parameters wrong, typically the tone or the offset. If you set maybe receive decode instead of encode, then that's not going to help you at all. You may have the wrong tone frequency. These tones, by the way, it's actually it's a pair. It's called a subaudible tone. It's very, very weak. As if somebody has the DEV turned up all the way, sometimes you can hear the tone, but most of the time when somebody's transmitting, you can't hear the tone. It tends to be a low frequency and under 250 hertz, and that's audible, but the level of it is very low. All the repeater has to be able to do is tell that it's there. Okay, so how can you troubleshoot? Well, first, once you've checked the settings, if you have a second radio, you can listen on the transmit side. So let's say it's a 147-900. Okay, you can have a second radio listening on 147-300 to see if in fact you're transmitting down 600 where it's expected, and that also confirms that your transmitter is actually working.
And Marty, that brings up a really good point. A lot of the radios, when you program in the offset, you then need to turn the offset on. So some of them require 2 steps. You have to turn on the offset and then set the frequency for the offset.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Especially if it's an odd split, then that's going to take some extra programming. Okay, and then if you're using your radio with accessories like a speaker mic and things like that, you might want to consider pulling those out temporarily. Keep it simple. Get down to the very basics: radio, power source, antenna, good known antenna, and get yourself. If you're indoors on your sofa and you can't hit the repeater that's 30 miles away, maybe you should get off your butt and go outside and find a high spot, climb to the hill at the back of the property, or drive to a local high spot and see if you can hit it there. A location is really critical. Location of your station, but mostly location of your antenna. We talked in the earlier sessions that you can go back and look at about the benefits of having an antenna on a roof versus an antenna that's sitting on top of the handheld and is 6 inches long.
One second here. I bumped a button. Here we go. Okay, and I actually added the line for you there, Marty.
Yes.
Get off the couch. Okay, so what else do you want to put in memories? We already talked about repeaters, but you can use memories also for simplex frequencies, especially the calling frequency. And if you operate satellites, you can program in satellite frequencies. So let's take a quick look at this. So with 2-meter repeaters, depending on what part of the country you're in, you'll have a different set of simplex frequencies. Make sure you use the one for your particular area. Some of them have 15 kilohertz splits. Some of them have 20 kilohertz splits. Some of them have both, like Alabama. Some have odd splits, like Alberta and part of Saskatchewan, and so forth. But make sure you use the ones for your area. Now, what you might want to do is consider programming in only the ones that are common to both areas. If you're on one of the border areas, those are the ones that are in green. And make sure you're probably going to want the calling frequency. So this is 2 meters. On 6 meters, here's the simplex frequencies. On 70 centimeters, here's the simplex frequencies. The 70 centimeter simplex frequencies are suggested frequencies, but they may not be the same in your area. Remember, at the beginning of this presentation, we talked about variations in band plans by location. So go back to week 1 and you can find more information on that. Here's a little chart just talking about the different portions of the band where the simplex channels are located.
Yeah, and Anthony, that particular table would not work for Southern California.
Correct.
We have typically 3 to 4 co-channeled repeaters on every available pair. It's that dense, and of course we use 20 kilohertz spacing instead of 25 like most of the country, just to try and squeeze more in. So absolutely check with your local frequency coordinator. If you get the ARRL repeater directory, they list the coordinating bodies for each area, and they always have websites, and the websites will list the current band plan generally, and often they'll put open repeaters, that is those that are not limited in who can use them. They'll put these open repeaters on a list as well. But take a look at that band plan, understand it, because if you just randomly go to a simplex frequency, hey, let's call on this frequency, and it may be the input to a repeater and you're bugging somebody, or it may be the output of a repeater and somebody's trying to listen to it and you're stronger because you're nearby. You don't want to do that.
Yeah, and you don't want to just ad lib it and try and pick something out because you might be on a satellite frequency on 2 meters or 440. So definitely don't try and guess and say, oh, this looks like a good frequency.
Yeah, and please don't go into the weak signal part of the band. Yes. It sounds like it's empty because you're on FM and you can't. FM is insensitive to changes in amplitude. And, sideband and AM are all amplitude, CW, they're all amplitude modulation. And you could be interfering with weak signal operations that you don't even know are there. I've heard, some certain group says, "Oh, we're going to buy all these radios and sit them down in the sideband portion because nobody uses it," and I beat the crap out of them to tell them not to do that. Besides, it's just bad practice, and they could really be interfering with something important.
So as far as satellites, especially for the low Earth orbit FM satellites, you're going to get some Doppler shift. So what you tend to do is put in a set of frequencies in the memories. This might be the mid-pass frequency, might be the suggested frequency for the satellite. But as the satellite passes from the first acquisition all the way through the last loss of signal, the Doppler shift will affect it. So by just being able to turn the knob one click, as opposed to having to tune the VFO, this can make it much more efficient to operate the low Earth orbit satellites. Also, you can put the split in crossband on a dual band radio, so this channel 1 memory will receive on one frequency and transmit on the other. So if you're using a single radio that doesn't have full duplex, you can still operate the low Earth orbit satellites with that particular HT without having full duplex if you program it properly. So see week 3 for more information on satellite operations. And don't forget, some satellites do require CT/CSS tones. Besides memories, what else should you consider? So I'm going to turn it back to you to go ahead. Marty? Marty, you're muted.
Sorry, there we go. As the real estate shrinks and the radios get smaller on the front panel, there are fewer and fewer knobs and buttons, and there are more things that are driven by menus. And some of these things affect how the radio operates on a day-to-day basis, and you're going to want to have some control over those. At least know they're there, and the default settings may not be to your liking. So let's look at some of those. First, squelch setting. There are some radios where you can't adjust the squelch anymore, except by doing it through a menu. Now, if the squelch is set too loose, of course, you're going to be hearing noise all the time when you don't want it. But if it's set very tight, you're going to be missing weak but readable signals that you really want to hear. So you may want to play around with the default squelch settings a little bit and set it down more and more sensitive until it doesn't trigger just from local noise, but you can hear those weaker signals. Some radios, especially those that have 2 bands, some of them have the option of you can have a single line display, or you can see the display for both bands. And that could be a good thing or a bad thing. If you have the dual line, sometimes the fonts are smaller. And if you're like me, they're too small to read. I want something I can see. And if I'm going to change bands, I'll push the band button and do that. We mentioned the automatic repeater shift earlier and recommending that you turn that off. Many radios have some sort of priority memory that you can set that says, hey, when I hit this button, I want to, wherever I am, I want to go back to this particular, this Aries repeater or whatever it is. And some of them have the ability to scan that once in a while, check for whether it's busy or not, and then go back to your regular listening. Transmitter timeout timer. These are generally useful, certainly on mobile radios, where you may set the microphone down in a bad position or have something bump into it and you're transmitting all the time. Well, you could be keying up a repeater for a long time or overheating your radio. So if you set the timeout timer to something like 3 minutes, that should kind of prevent the egregious cases of that. But I would not make it too short, because there are going to be times when you need to make a longer transmission. Automatic power off. If the radio isn't been used, if you haven't touched a control or you haven't received a signal for a certain period of time, it'll cut the power off to save the battery. Certainly in an emergency situation, that's a bad thing. I would recommend that you leave APO off and simply be judicious about some of the other settings we'll talk about. We talked about the default power level. In many radios, the default power level is the highest one available. And as we said, if you've got a good signal margin to your target, whether it's a repeater or you're all operating on at a campsite and everybody's within 500 yards of each other, you don't need that high power. You can get it down low. Backlighting, backlighting generally does consume some power. You want to make sure that it's bright enough that you can see it when you need it, including during the daytime. But you also want to make sure that it doesn't stay on all the time, because that's just eating up power when you don't need it. So there are usually some ways to set how long it is going to stay on after you make your adjustments before it goes dark again. There are some user programmable keys or soft keys, and that's come in very handy. Many of my radios have a user programmable key. You can pick one of the functions that you tend to like a lot, and instead of having to go through the menu to get to them, you just hit that key and make whatever adjustment you're going to make. One of the common ways I use that on a handheld is to reverse the transmit and receive, so that if I want to hear if somebody's on the input, I just hit that button and I'm listening on the input, and then when I let go, I'm back on the output, or I toggle it again and I'm back on the output. But you may find there are other functions that you want to access quickly, and you can program it into one of those keys. We mentioned earlier the key press beep, which I find extremely annoying. Usually you can set the volume. I set the volume at 0 on all my radios, and it has never been a problem. That's really the preferred way. It doesn't drive you nuts when you're programming something. Some radios, particularly those, say, operating on 900 megahertz, they may give you a choice between wide and narrow FM. Generally speaking, if they're on 900, you don't have a choice in receive, but you do have a choice in transmit. And if you're transmitting on a frequency that where a lot of people are using commercial radios, you're probably going to want to use narrow FM. It'll work on wide, but you'll sound over deviated. And if it's customarily narrow on a non-commercial radio channel, then if it's set on wide, it's going to, it's set on narrow, you're going to sound very weak and very low audio. So check and see what makes the most sense for the particular frequency. Again, this is usually not a problem on 2 meters. It can be on 70 centimeters, especially if you're using a commercial radio, and certainly on 900, same thing. Some of them have the option for tone calling. 1750 hertz is a common tone frequency for Europe. Their repeater systems they're not as densely clustered as ours are, so they often just use that tone to make sure that you're bringing up a repeater. In fact, a lot of people learn to whistle 1750 hertz so they don't have to even program it in. Some radios, a lot of them have more than just n number of memories. They divide that into memory banks, and you may want to access a certain bank of memories and maybe putting all the repeater and simplex frequencies for your Aries group, for example, into these banks here. Maybe one for all the repeaters, one for all the simplex frequencies, and then you have another one for other local repeaters, and you have another one for perhaps public service, with just listen only frequencies. So think about how you want to organize those and how you access them. Some of these, a lot of radios on VHF have the ability to pick up the National Weather Service broadcast. There's a batch of frequencies up in the 160 megahertz range. Find those that you can hear locally, and you may want to save those. Some have severe weather alert. My radios don't, but there's an SAME function where particularly if you live in tornado country or something like that, you may be able to program the radio to get that alert. Scan settings. I don't often scan, but some people like to do that, and they may pick 3 or 4 different frequencies they want to listen to, and simply run those, run them constantly. So whenever any one of them gets action, you'll hear it fairly quickly. Somebody just mentioned in chat, they may use a bank of memories for a different town or somewhere where they tend to travel. You should also know how to turn on Vox operation if that radio has it. I generally leave that off because there are too many other things going on around you that you don't want to be triggering your transmit unnecessarily. But locking the keypad, when you're going to be on a specific frequency, say you're at a hospital and you're doing a hospital drill, or there's an incident, and you don't want, you're going to be walking around, but you don't want to bump the keypad and actually jump into a different frequency, and you think everything's quiet and they've been calling you. That's a bad thing. So learn to use that keypad lock, and that will make sure that you don't accidentally bump it and change the frequency. When I run an HF net several HF nets every Sunday morning, and when I'm on that net frequency, my HF radio has a lock function. I lock that dial so that if I bump it, I'm not off frequency. So that's a good function to have. You may be able to lock out the transmit. If you're going to give the radio to a non-ham to listen or monitor, you can maybe set it so they can't transmit. Some radios have Bluetooth, or you can adjust your display color. And then, of course, when you're at on sideband or HF, sideband CW, there are a lot of other default choices that you may want to change. But again, get to know what you can change in the radio. And let's turn it back to Anthony for some digital stuff.
Well, this is a little bit different than the programming aspect, but we didn't really cover it in the first three, so I wanted to cover it this time. So by using something called sound card modes in a computer, you can modulate, demodulate for different types of operating modes, similar to what a modem does. Most but not all require single sideband capable VHF radios. There is some FM stuff we'll talk about later, but in a lot of cases, things like FT8, FT4, you're going to need a single sideband radio, so you're not going to be able to do this with your HT, but there are some things you can do. If the radio does not have a built-in sound card, you will need to add a sound card interface. You will also need appropriate cables to interface with your radio. Here's some examples of some of the sound card interfaces. Most of the time we think about these on HF, but there's a lot of FT8 activity on 6 meters, and during contest you'll also hear FT8 and FT4 activity on 2 meters. These are just some examples of some of the sound card interfaces if your radio does not have a built-in sound card interface.
And by the way, those same interfaces are going to be very useful if you're going to use digital messaging. Such as VARA.
And that's where we're going to be coming up here real quick. But first of all, one of the most popular modes out there is WSJTX suite. It has FT8 and FT4 in it for everyday context and contesting, but it also has a meteor scatter mode, MSK 144, and two modes that are used for Earth, Moon, Earth bounce, Q65 and JT65. If you're interested in a digital mode that allows you to do keyboard messaging that's not limited to 14 characters like FT8 is, JSA Call is a version of FT8 built on the FT8 engine, and it lets you do longer transmissions. Some groups for MCOM use narrowband messaging using FL Digi and FL Message. Now these can be done with acoustical coupling, but you get much better results if you use a sound card interface. And here's a link out here on setting up for these narrowband modes from Jeff JTK, who's from Ohio area. He's the section coordinator. Now, Marty mentioned VARA, and if you add EA5 HVK's VARA software and you add WinLink software, that expands your emergency communications option greatly. VARA HF is used on HF, but it's also used on 6 meters. It does require single sideband radio, WinLink capable, but there's also something called VARA FM. And we have a RATPAC presentation from Oliver Dooley, K6OIL, that you can go back and watch the video on VARA FM. It's been one of our most popular videos, actually. So if you want to get more out of your radio through digital sound card modes, here's some information for you. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. Again, tiny.cc BG VHF will get you access to this slideshow and all of the materials in it. And again, we have the recordings available, and we have the RATPAC list with all of the presentations out there. So if you want to find any of the presentations, we now have over 260 recorded presentations for RATPAC. So what we'll do is we'll go back and take questions. I'll turn it back over to Dan.
Hey, Anthony and Marty, can you comment on choosing a good frequency for a digital hotspot?
Ooh.
I could comment on some of the frequencies you don't want to use. I think that's probably what Marty was going to say too. You want to stay out of the satellite downlinks and uplinks. You want to stay off of a local repeater's frequency. You want to stay out of the weak signal area for sure. So everything we talked about earlier when choosing that simplex channel probably applies for setting up your hotspot too.
Yeah, and let me just mention one very popular maker of these hotspots. They pre-program it for a frequency that happens to be the national simplex calling frequency on 70 centimeters. And I have written and called them to tell them, God, don't do that. You know, what you do is if somebody's going to buy it, you ask them to contact their frequency coordinator for that band and ask whether, you know, where that should be placed. And if they don't have one, they need to figure it out. But they don't want it sitting somewhere where you're going to be interfering with repeaters or interfering with normal voice simplex operation. Most coordinators have some things set aside for digital, and they may assign you one of those. But please check with your frequency coordinator before you go and place one of those things.
Okay. Anthony, can you lower your desktop?
Yes, I am doing it right now.
Beautiful. Do we have any questions out there? Hands, please. Looking for hands, no hands. Barry, how are we doing on chat?
We've answered most of the questions on chat.
How efficient.
And we've had some good suggestions and comments in chat as well. So thank you guys for chiming in.
That's what it's all about, folks. All right. Are there any comments?
All complaints go to Dan.
Oh, yeah. They usually do one way or the other. Okay, folks.
Great job. Great job. Great presentation. This is Gene and Colleen.
Thank you, Gene.
Thank you. And again, all the other three sessions are available via recordings that you can watch. And please, I know a lot of you have a lot of experience already, but suggest these 3 videos to your new hams, especially if you teach a class, if you have new members in your club, put it in your newsletter that these 3 sessions are available. These 4 sessions now are available. And also, along with Dennis W6DQ, we did a session of 3 beginner HF sessions in October. So there's these 4 beginner VHF, UHF, and 3 beginner HF sessions that are available in the RATPAC recordings.
I might throw in there real quick. If you guys got suggestions for these and others, something that would be beneficial for all concerned, let us know. We are always looking for input and suggestions, and rate us, if you will. Tell us, hey, that was a good one, or well, I wish you had done this different. So let us know. We got email addresses, and that's what it's for.
And tomorrow night I'll be covering FT8 and FT4 in a lot more depth. So if you were interested in that, I know I only talked for 1 or 2 slides. I'll be talking about that extensively tomorrow night.
Okay, I'm the one that requested that from Anthony. He works FT8 a lot. FT8 by itself is really simple to use. However, it's got a lot of bells and whistles to it, and Anthony's going to cover that. It makes it a lot handier to work with, and a lot more fun. It's better than just sitting there hitting the button. You get to do a lot more with it. Okay.
Well, Dan, one other quick thing. I just want to remind everyone, if you were interested in the VHF UHF, this weekend is the ARRL January VHF UHF. So it's a chance to get on the air. Even if you only have FM, in more densely populated areas, you might find some activity on FM. But if you have single sideband, definitely try out single sideband, try out FT8, FT4, CW, anything you want to try out. But this is a great weekend. A lot of people complain that there's not much simplex activity or not much single sideband activity on VHF, UHF, but there are 4 weekends where I can almost guarantee you that's the January, June, and September ARRL VHF, UHF contest, and the CQ VHF, UHF contest in July. So get on the air during those.
Okay, and let's not forget about the ARRL's volunteer on the air thing they have got going now. That's in session all this year. It's got a lot. They're still trying to adjust it, but that's another contest in the sense that you can get out there and make a lot of points, learn a lot of things about operating skills and so forth. Gene, you got your hand up there. Sorry to hold you up. Go ahead.
That's no problem. Yeah, basic question I have is Echolink. Is RATPAC associated with Echolink at all? And if so, does it have a specific node?
We're not. It's not something we're specifically associated with. It's a function of you tying a repeater to an internet connection. So you can take a standard repeater and add an Echolink component to it by having either at the repeater site or even at a local ham in your group can set it up at their home so that you can tie the repeater using Echolink. And I have a little brief thing on Echolink. I can put a link in the chat. Well, give me 1 second. I'll find that and put it in the chat. But while we're doing that, why don't you go ahead and take other if we have any other questions while I find the Echolink.
Gene, did you have anything more? I took a hand.
No, I'm sorry. I meant to, I'm trying to get rid of my hand raised, but no, I'm done. Thank you.
All right, now you got the yes button up. Okay, that's fine. Okay, any more questions out there?
So Dan, I'm putting the link in the chat right now. This is a little document that I created for our Ohio section newsletter on using Echolink, and I can bring it up on the screen to show you what it looks like real quickly here. It's not the most complicated, but it's just a very simple introduction to Echolink. And it was actually, we ran this because we run a youth net in Ohio on one of the local repeaters, but we want people to check in from a distance. So this is just a quick get started guide for Echolink. This one little, actually you can use this shortcut. I forgot there's this shortcut, so I'll put the shortcut in the chat also. You don't need to use that big long. There's the shortcut to this document. But it talks about how to set up Echolink on your local computer and access Echolink linked repeaters around the world.
Easy for you to say.
Yes, it is.
All right.
All right. Thank you very much. I do appreciate that.
Not a problem. Glad that we can help there. Anybody else?
David was asking if we plan on doing any more like this. Can you give us a little more idea, David, of what particular you'd like us to do? If you're still there, he had that in chat. You can unmute if you're there, David, and let us know. Okay, he must be gone.
Do you plan on doing more presentations like it?
Well, we do presentations every Wednesday and Thursday night. Wednesday nights are general topics, and we basically want to give topics for whatever people are interested in. So if you have topics, please suggest them. But we will be continuing. If you're new to RATPAC, we do this every week with a few exceptions for some of the holidays. So tomorrow night will be FT8, FT4. Next week we have, I don't remember what's up on the schedule. Dan, you want to bring up the schedule real quick there?
I can.
Handy? I got
I
it.
think I caught it on the Zoom information that Ian's put out on Facebook.
Yes, and I can bring it up on the screen here real quick if you want. But this is the link that'll get you all the RATPAC presentations. I got too many things on the screen.
I'll be glad to pass this on to local nets here in the Pittsburgh area. Also, you can also operate EchoLink from HT, but there's a delay in it if you're operating UHF and VHF.
Yeah, and this is what the list looks like. And by the way, I'm within striking distance on Simplex sometimes. So one of the things I really strongly suggest, if you're getting into VHF and UHF and you have a dual band mobile or something in your shack, keep one of the channels on a Simplex frequency and you'll be surprised at how much activity. I always monitor 146.52 here, and I get people from the Pittsburgh area quite often. I'm located near Akron. So right now you should be seeing our upcoming sessions. The FT8, FT4 tomorrow night. We have Linux software for amateur
It's not
radio.
showing.
I'm not sure.
Not showing.
Share your screen.
Let me try that again. There we go. You should be seeing it now.
Yep.
Okay, so these are the upcoming sessions. We have Linux software for amateur radio. Which switch is which? Marty's doing that next week.
That's going to be talking about both DC and RF and AC and RF switches and some things you may not have known and some safety and performance factors and so on.
We're going to have Carl talking about FEMA National Mobile Emergency Response Services, MERS, solar generators, which is just in time to start getting your kit ready for this summer, from Diana. FCC banned products, announcements, and rumors of amateur radio impact. This should be a great session with Michelle and Dennis coming up. And then we have a preview of the Ham Expo. The Ham Expo is coming up later this spring, and Eric Guth, the person that's the founder and runs the Ham Radio Expo, is going to be talking about Ham Radio Expo and something he calls the Academy, or amateur radio community, and that'll be coming up in March. So there's about 250 plus recordings, and you can view any of the recordings, get any of the documents from each of the presentations and the slideshows, etc. You can also download the videos. If you want to show one of these videos at your local club and you don't have an internet connection there, use the Vimeo link to download it. And once you download it, you can bring it with you and you won't need an internet connection. And we definitely don't have any problem with you showing these sessions at your local club meeting. We actually encourage it. And finally, if you go to the RATPAC website, which is ratpac.us, you can sign up for our different mailing list. You can watch a little video on RATPAC. And of course, these all the sessions are also embedded here, and the Zoom link is here for each week. So ratpac.us is the link for the website.
One comment.
Thank you. Have a great night, all.
Thank you. One of the comments on the Zoom session, we've changed so it's always the same URL, always the same password or passcode thing. So you can even put a shortcut on your desktop there and have it where you can click it if you get right in Wednesdays and Thursdays. All right. Anybody else?
Well, thanks all for hanging in there with us. We appreciate your being here.
Yes. And with that, I'm going to say 73 and kill the section and see you guys the next go around.
Okay. Everybody have a good night.